Welcome back, everybody, to the 21st episode of the Doc Talk podcast, proudly produced in partnership with the Ottawa Rowing Club. I'm your host, Zach Lewis, and I started this podcast with the goal of fostering the community that surrounds the sport of rowing. I hope to do this through a variety of concise and insightful conversations with individuals from all over the rowing world. Rowers, coaches, and practitioners of the sport, both past and present, will share their knowledge and stories with the goal of educating, inspiring, and motivating our listeners. I'm excited to have Jason Dorland on the podcast with us today. Jason is an Olympic rower, performance coach, public speaker, and an accomplished author. He's also an advocate for building a more inviting world for young athletes, focusing on the journey as opposed to the result, and fostering a love for what they're doing along the way. Jason joins us today to discuss his rowing career, lessons learned while coaching, and his newest book release. It's my pleasure to introduce to the podcast, Jason Dorland. Welcome to the show, Jason. It's great to have you. How are you doing?
I'm well, and thanks for having me. Yeah, it's great to be here.
Of course. Where are you joining us from today?
From Victoria.
Victoria, BC. Nice.
Yeah, Victoria, BC. Yeah, we are venturing into spring, actually. So it's one of the perks of living on the island for sure.
Absolutely. Have you been out there since you joined the National Training Center? Just never left, or did you go back afterwards?
Yeah, I think there's an expression, you could swing a fish in any part of southern Vancouver Island and likely hit an Olympian, right? I think so many of us moved out here, myself in '85, and we just never left, right? You get used to the climate, you get used to the pace and the lifestyle, and I grew up in St. Catharines, Ontario, and I certainly loved that place, but it was known as the Garden City, and so is Victoria. So I just say that I live in the other Garden City now. So, and it's been my home ever since.
Well, I've never heard the swing a fish expression, but I guess it makes a lot of sense when you put it that way.
Yes.
Now,
yeah.
you mentioned you're from St. Catharines, which is kind of like the mecca or the junior rowing hub in North America anyways. Typically, we start off by asking our guests how they got involved with the sport of rowing from day one. So being from St. Catharines, I assume it was something that you were exposed to fairly early?
Well, it was. My granddad rowed for St. Catharines. My dad rowed for St. Catharines. He was part of a winning crew after the war in, I think, 47, 48. They won the St. Catharines, as the St. Catharines lightweight crew. They won that at the Henley.
Very cool.
And then all the years later, my dad was the rowing manager at Ridley College. And my two older brothers, Scott and Paul, both rowed at the school where Neil Campbell was the coach. And, and so, I won't say it was an expectation, but I was certainly aware of the sport, and I was aware of its impact on my older brothers and how much they enjoyed it and what they got to do. And so when my term came, 1981, grade 11, that was my first chance to row for Neil, and I certainly jumped at it and just sort of never looked back after that.
Well, I figured there'd have to be some sort of driver, considering your grandfather and your father both rode St. Catharines, and then you started wearing orange. I mean, it's a little bit sacrilegious in some scenarios around there.
I suppose. I wasn't aware of I wasn't really aware of the rivalry, if you will, between Ridley and St. Catharines until I started rowing, right? And then you could just feel it down on the island. And it's something when I went back there to coach actually in 2010 to 2014, it was something I wanted to try and address. I just felt like my views had changed on rowing. I was no longer the combative athlete that I was as a younger man, and I wanted to try and address that and change that. And some people came along for the ride and others not. I mean, it's a big conversation, but I just feel that, I felt at the time too, that it didn't help the sport, right? It didn't. I mean, rivalries are fine, but there's certainly rivalries that existed out here on the island when I was coaching at Shawnigan. Brentwood, obviously a natural rival, but hell, I got along with Brian Carr, who was the coach there. We were good friends, or we are good friends.
Yep.
And it just didn't make sense to me to have this very, what I considered an unhealthy rivalry between the two schools. And so, we would train together, we would mix our boats up. It was just we just saw it as the way to play. And so when I came back to Ridley in 2010, my views had changed big time around the notion of rivalry and who competitors were and what their role was. And so, part of part of what I tried to take on was the idea that you don't have to hate your competitors, right? They can be your friends. And you even look to the word competitor. And I think in North America, certainly in Western culture, we've bastardized the term. The Latin root word of competitor is competire, which means to strive together, not against. And so much of the narrative around competition in North America is against. And I think we limit our athletes when we see it through that paradigm, where it's one against the other versus one with the other. And yes, it's a nuance, but there's such a different way to play when you see your competition as someone you race with and not against.
I couldn't agree more. And I do want to delve a little bit deeper into your athlete and coaching philosophy
Right,
in just a couple minutes, but I'd love to know a little bit more about your first couple strokes. You're taking them at Ridley College Boat Club. Neil
right.
Campbell is your coach. You're fortunate enough to have one of the most iconic Canadian rowing coaches of all time walk you through your first season. What was that experience like, both from a high school perspective and from having Neil as your instructor?
Yeah, just in you painting that picture, I just I can feel my nerves come up, and I remember very vividly that first time getting into the boat. We were training down in Philadelphia out of the University of Pennsylvania. Ted Nash was the head coach there, and he and Neil obviously had a relationship. We were able to go down there and train, and it was March break, and it was the first time I was getting in a boat with Neil as my coach, and I was intimidated, and I mean, scared would be a fair word.
Yep.
So, um, but it like all of that, those initial moments, it faded, and soon was just replaced with, I think, thrill would be the word. I found it thrilling to be in that boat with Neil as our coach. At 16, I didn't appreciate who he was
Of course.
or what he offered at the time. He was, I certainly knew him. He'd been at the house a lot, working with my dad, but I had no idea of his international reputation, let alone as a two-time Olympian. And uh, but as the season progressed, you learned how to row and you learned how to move that boat, and you realized that we had a pretty good crew. We were young, but it was just fun. It was genuinely thrilling to be in that crew and make it go as fast as it did. That was my first year, was for sure one of my most enjoyable, I would say.
So you go from this hyper enjoyable, fun, loving environment to the next step, which you describe a little bit in some of the conversations we've had, that becomes uber competitive, one against self, kind of that American or North American understanding of competitor.
For sure.
How did that come about? Was that a vying for a spot in the top boat? Was that deciding that you wanted a university scholarship, that your Olympics is in your sights, or kind of what was that transition point?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it was, I'm going to say, a natural evolution back then. I mean, I just think it was normal. It's what I picked up from my peers. It's certainly what I picked up from Neil. And that's no disrespect to Neil. It's just what he knew, right? He was sort of the John Wayne of coaching. It was a very male, macho, egocentric approach to coaching, right? It was a war paradigm, right? And Neil drew on that those expressions and in that platform as a way to motivate and for us to race. I mean, a race was considered a war, and the course was considered a battlefield, and all of the sort of traditional sport analogies that one would hear.
Yep.
And I ate it up, and
As
you know
16-year-old boys do.
as they do, you betcha. And I just think that's, in reflection again, just appreciating the power of influence that coaches have. And I was that boy, right? Neil walked on water, and it was all about making Neil happy. And so, yeah, and I just fell into that world, and quite willingly, actually.
And all that makes total sense. Having coached 16-year-old boys, having been a 16-year-old boy, you are a product of your environment, and you are such a sponge, especially when you're trying to impress somebody or take those next
Right.
steps. I mean, it's completely logical, the progression. So you go from Ridley to Syracuse University. Did you row 4 years there, or did you end up jumping over to Victoria?
Yeah, so I was 2 years there. I was in a freshman program. Larry Laszlo was our freshman coach, great coach. And he did a remarkable job recruiting that year. We had some of the top rowers in North America, and in fact, we were ranked number one Sports Illustrated, and we were undefeated through our dual regatta season. And it wasn't up until the IRAs that we underperformed in that final, and we finished second to Princeton, and that was unexpected. But that was a fast crew, and I really, looking back, enjoyed my time there. But the national team was knocking, and I knew that moving to the West Coast and going to UVic and training on the island with that national team, sort of group, it was going to provide the best path to the national team and what I aspired to. So, as much as the education I was getting at UVic or at Syracuse was world class, and the facilities and on, I just felt like Victoria was where I needed to be.
Fair enough. And I mean, it ended up working out. I mean, at least from an outsider's perspective, not to guess on your perspective, but you end up going to UVic. You join the National Team Training Center. You get on the team that ends up going to Seoul for the '88 Games. I guess I would kind of be remiss to interview an Olympian and not ask them about their Olympic experience, if you wouldn't mind talking about
Yeah,
that just a
well,
little bit.
sure. I think that first year. I mean, goodness, got on to it was in '86. Actually, the Commonwealth Games were trialing rowing again as another, just giving it another shot. I don't know how many years it had been since rowing had been in the Commonwealth Games, but it was sort of on board to see how it went. And so I was part of that crew, and I was in the eight, and then we went to the World Championships in Nottingham that year, and it was a really fun year, right? Just my first time racing internationally,
Yep.
and my first taste of what it was like to see European world class rowers, and to see the size of these men. I was a kid still,
Yep.
and so, the next 2 years, it was the focus was getting on that eight. I knew that if I wanted to row for Neil again, I had to be on the men's eight, and so I got bigger and stronger, and was able to get myself onto that crew. Four returning members from the 1984 crew, same Coxie, and of course Neil, and we left for Seoul. It was a late Olympics that year because of weather, because of climate. So the Olympics took place during the end of September, and I mean, goodness, going to Seoul, that was for a kid growing up in a small town, Southern Ontario. That was, it was a bit mind blowing. I'm
I can
not
imagine.
going to lie, just the size of that city, and the pace. But yeah, we were defending Olympic champions. Obviously, after how the men had done in '84, Neil's crew winning that Olympic final, setting an Olympic record at 5:41, and so there was a lot of expectation, a lot of excitement. Um, and I was, I was certainly keen to repeat, as was every member of that crew.
Yep.
And like so many times in sport, it just didn't go. It didn't go to the script, right?
Not for you guys anyway.
Second in the heat, second in the rep, and with lots of expectation in that final, and we finished last, right? We finished DFL in that final, and that was a moment, right? That was a moment.
So, how did that moment affect the trajectory of your rowing career, your psyche towards continued training?
Right. Well, I mean, I'd lost races before. Goodness, I think winning the IRA or losing the IRAs was probably the biggest disappointment I had had up until that point.
Yep.
And then losing at the World Championships, but in that way, there was more perspective. It was like, holy crap, Jace! Like you're lining up beside some legends, right? The Abignalis when I was racing in the Cox Pair in '87,
Yep.
and Holmes and Redgrave, for goodness sake, right? Like, so there was perspective in terms of, okay, cut yourself some slack here, right? These guys are established world champion rowers, and chances are you're not going to come out of the gates and dominate this race from start line to finish line.
Yep.
But by the time I got into that 8, my confidence was on a different level because of what I knew Neil did and what he was capable of. And of course, when we raced in Lucerne, 3-4 months earlier than Seoul, we were leading at the 1,000-meter mark against the same crews that we would meet in the final at the Olympics.
Yep.
And so we had incredible boat speed. Right? I'd never been in a boat that could come off the line like that crew could, or generate the kind of sprint that boat could. And we ended up finishing just fourth, just out of the bronze medal. And so the message was okay. I mean, we raced after 3 weeks of being together, so we had put together a crew that was capable of tremendous speed. We just needed time together to sort of figure out that last 1,000 meters, and that was the plan. But it just didn't happen, and so I think it wasn't so much. There was surprise and shock and obviously some anger and disappointment,
Yep.
but it wasn't really until I got home and saw the result of that race in the paper that other emotions came up, right? As I talk about in Chariots and Horses, right, in my first book, sitting on my parents' living room couch and looking at the front page of the Globe and Mail, the sports section, and there's our photograph, right, slumped over our oars, and the headline, Canadians bomb out in Seoul. And this was about a week after the final. And so I think that was the moment where things changed, right? It wasn't just that we had lost for ourselves, we had lost for the country. And the power and the importance of that loss really hit home over the next days, weeks, months. And so that shock and disappointment turned to shame and embarrassment. And those are two different beasts, right?
Yep. Absolutely.
Shame especially, right? And so I really didn't know what to do with myself. And so my strategy was to just take off, was just to get out of Dodge. And so I went off to Australia, and I just needed time away from the sport. And so that's how that played out.
Now, having the benefit of time and being able to look
Right.
back, what do you think are some of the most key lessons that you can take away from that experience and could potentially pass on to an athlete that may in the future be experiencing something similar, whether it be a national
Yeah,
teamer
that's
or a university athlete or whatever?
for sure. Right. And I think that's another great question. Yeah, hindsight is beautiful, right? It's a gift.
Yep.
And in looking back on that moment, it wasn't, sure, we underperformed, we lost, there was huge expectation. on and on and on, right? Was that a drag? Yeah, it was huge drag. But as we all know, in competition, right, somebody's going to lose, right? That's just the way that's the rules. And, um, but I just didn't think it was going to be us. And so I think in hindsight, I think, just having the healthy conversation around what losing looks like. And that became part of my strategy as a coach. It was that I would sit down with the crew and make it very clear to them that there was a possibility that at the national championships or racing down in the States or wherever, that losing was one of the options, right? That could be the way this ended.
Yep.
And I wanted them to appreciate that that didn't make them bad people. It didn't mean that they were lesser than in terms of athletes. It didn't mean their parents weren't going to love them or get kicked out of the house or what. Like it just meant that they came. It just meant that there was somebody else on the day who was able to make a boat go faster than they were,
Yep.
and that's it. And to not make it mean any more than that. And I had coaches that used to say, why the hell do you even have that conversation? Why would you want your athletes even thinking about losing, backing into those starting gates? And for me, the strategy was to demystify losing, to make it so that, if I were to make it for myself, so that if I were to back into the starting gates on that day, I wasn't worried about losing. The idea of losing wasn't a fear, right? I was excited to be in that starting gates, not afraid of what might happen if we lost. And knowing now the way our ego works, the way motivation works, we take the notion of the chase. So the idea of winning an Olympic gold medal becomes, in our mind, the threat of losing an Olympic gold medal. And that's the fuel that it becomes, right? Our mind takes the potential of winning and turns it into the threat of losing. And so if you demystify the threat of losing, you sort of damper down the impact of fear on your athletes when they sit in the starting gates. And so it's not like I was saying it's okay if you lose and I don't care what happens. That's not it at all. What I was saying was that losing is something that might happen here. And if you go into those starting gates afraid of that outcome, you are going to undermine your ability to perform in the moment on the day. And so it just became a strategy, nothing more.
And I think it makes total sense preparing athletes the same way you prepare them for adverse weather or a delayed start or anything else. The more kind of spectrum we can give them on what could happen, the less there is that could rattle them in the start gates or be detrimental post race.
Right. Exactly.
And after you took a step back from competing yourself, it didn't take very long before you were involved with rowing again, this time in a coaching capacity. Right. You went to Australia, coached there, came back, coached in BC, coached back at Ridley, had a couple of very cool opportunities to kind of come full circle post your competitive career. And your love what you're doing coaching philosophy seemed to resonate with a lot of the crews that you had. And it was arguably ahead of its time, considering we're in a stage now where everybody talks about athlete first coaching, as opposed to the do as I say, not as I do kind of methodology that seemed to be a little bit more old school.
Yes.
Why do you think this approach was so effective, especially with younger athletes or young men or whatever demographic you're predominantly working with?
Yeah. Wow, big question. Yeah, I think I would totally agree that the notion of an athlete-centric coaching approach is becoming more the norm, right? This holistic approach where we take care of the whole being and it isn't do as I say, right? I mean, goodness, if I think back to my time rowing for Neil, it was, it was everything everything was about do as Neil says, and you never question, right? And again, no hit on Neil there. It was just the time. That's the way things rolled. And but I think now, what sort of transformed me as a coach was really meeting Robin, my wife, and watching her way of being on the national team as a middle distance runner, and then how she showed up on the world stage, and sort of getting an inside view into her world and how she approached training, how she approached her competitors, how she approached loss and winning, and all of it, and just some really big and deep conversations with her as I returned to coaching, sort of late 90s, early 2000s, where she would really challenge my old paradigms around winning at all costs and battlefield, and it's a war, and all that kind of stuff. And in those conversations, it was hard to defend what I had believed for all those years based on the questions that she was asking, which was basically, how does this serve your athletes? And how does this create a container for them to perform at their best? And when I was faced with those kinds of questions, I didn't have an answer. And so, I went looking for one, and I started embracing Robin's approach, her process-centered approach to high performance. Everything was about process, where losing was just information, winning was just information. Winning and losing were byproducts of good process. It was, it in so many ways, it took the emotion out of competition and just made it about controlling the controllables and just going out and being your best and doing your best. And, when I was a young athlete, if someone had told me to go out and do my best, I would have laughed, right? I would have considered that a soft approach.
Yep.
Not manly enough. But
not competitive.
When I hung around Robin, year after year, season after season, and I watched her approach not just be pretty good, but sort of land her on the podium multiple times at international events, I sort of thought, wow, there's something to this. And so I embraced it. And, as they say, you can't argue the results. And I started having this response where the crews that I was coaching became really good and began to win national championships, and not just once in a while, but year after year. And so I continued to hone that coaching philosophy of focusing on process, creating a safe container, taking war and hate and winning only out of the conversation, making it all about getting better. Using the word love constantly with those boys, encouraging them to love one another, encouraging them to love the sport, to come down to practice because it made them feel good. Though that was the container. That's what I tried to build. And, and the byproduct of that, was some pretty cool races.
Pretty fantastic results.
I would agree. Yeah.
Now, I've had the benefit of hearing you speak, and I think our listeners would be intrigued to hear the quote from the paper the morning after your Ridley crew won CSSRAs.
Right. Yeah. Wow. That was a fun day, and a fun moment for me the next day. So, just to give some background, I had been hired to come back to Ridley in 2010, and that was after my stint at Shawnigan, where we had done some pretty cool things. And
yep.
And so I had a bit of a reputation, and that reputation attracted a lot of athletes. As people will know listening, that rowing is a sport where you can transfer schools and compete in the same academic year. And so when I arrived at Ridley, there were a number of young boys that transferred schools, and they came with a very clear agenda, right? They wanted to win the Calder Cleland. They wanted to win a national championship. Their parents certainly wanted that. The school wanted that. The alumni. Many of those young boys wanted scholarships to the U.S. Right? They wanted all of these things. Right? There were tangible reasons for making that move and engaging in the program. And so, we trained very hard for 2 years. I'm a big believer that if you're going to shift culture, you better have some patience, because it's going to take time, and it did. It took 2 years to develop a foundation, and then by that second year, they were ready to race at the level that perhaps they expected, and certainly I felt they were capable of. So showing up at the CSSRAs, I would say they were a favored crew.
Mm-hmm.
They were big lads, and they could move an 8. And in that heat, they rode 5:44, which I think still is a course record, and then came back the next day in the final and won the final. And they got everything they were looking for, right? The medals, their name on the Calder Cleland. Some of them got scholarships to the U.S. But for me, as much as it was made clear when I was hired by the head of school what their expectations were, none of their expectations or wants or wishes were mine. What I wanted to do was transform the lives of those boys, right? And rowing was going to be the way we did that.
Yep.
And I was going to introduce and try and convince them that love was the foundation to their best race. That when they accepted that when they loved one another as much or more than winning that race, then that's when the cool stuff would start to happen. And because what came from love was trust, and what came from trust was safety. And when you're in a safe environment, you can perform at levels far greater than when you're in a threatened state. And so the day after that final, excuse me, I got, the St. Catharines Standard arrived at our door, and I opened up the paper, and there they are on the front page of the sports section. And there's an interview, right? There's an article, and they interview the coxswain of the crew, and they ask her, what makes these boys so fast? And her answer was, well, there's a lot of love in this boat. And for me, that was the first time that I had any indication that I was making any headway with them, right?
Yeah.
I had never heard them articulate, even though I used the word love at least once a practice, as I would encourage them to build the love. I mean, that was an expression that I used. And there it was in black and white, coming out of the coxie's mouth, just saying, that she was willing to state on that, in that moment, the reason those boys were able to do what they had done was because of love. And that was my gold medal, right? That was my moment where I had realized that, wow, they had truly bought into what we were trying to build.
They have heard me. I have made a difference. There's a reason I'm here.
Yes. Teenage boys can listen to people. So there you go. It was, I'm not going to lie. It was Niagara Falls. I was bawling when I read that article, because it just reaffirmed the reason that I had come, right? I mean, I understood what the school wanted, but it wasn't what I wanted. I mean, sure, yeah, I wanted to rebuild the program, and the rowing program at Ridley meant a lot to me, but it wasn't what brought me there, right?
Of course.
It didn't mean that much to me. What meant a lot to me was the opportunity to work with some exceptional young men, and that was the draw.
Fantastic. Now, I've had the opportunity to watch some of your recent interviews and read some of your online media. One of the things that you talk about fairly regularly is the decrease in participation in sport in Canada, particularly in youth or adolescence. Do you think this is tied to the love of the sport or the environment that has been created for a lot of these kids?
Oh, undoubtedly. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's and I don't know how long I don't know how long you want to chat, but I point my fingers directly at Own the Podium as being the catalyst of that, right? I feel like the inception of Own the Podium, as much as I agree with uh, what the mission of Own the Podium is,
Supporting high performance athletes achieve medals.
you betcha. On every, like, better coaching, better facilities, better lifestyle, I'm a fan of all of that. I wish that had been around in my day.
Of course.
Where I think we trip ourselves up is in the branding, right? Um, in the persona of Own the Podium, right? It is a win at all costs. If you want us to celebrate you, you have to land on the podium. That does not support a safe environment,
Yep.
right? What it does is it creates a pressure cooker where if you want to be, like I said, if you want to be celebrated, you have to land on that podium. And if you look at 2010 in Vancouver, when in that first week we had medal hopefuls who were, for lack of a better term, crashing and burning, some of them literally.
Not burning, thankfully.
No, not the burning part. Sorry, thank you. But having unexpected blips, right, where they weren't doing what they were supposed to do or what the expectation was. And Stephen Brunt captured it beautifully in his video essay when he talked about what happened in the second week, where unexpected Canadian athletes showed up and owned the podium, right? Got onto the podium.
Yep.
And then Vancouver became what it became, which was our greatest showing ever at an Olympic Games. But I would argue it was in spite of the name Own the Podium. I think, as Stephen Brunt articulates, the athletes realized, and I'm quoting him here, that no matter where they landed on that podium, Canadians were going to embrace them, right? And when they figured that out in the second week, that's when the floodgates opened. And that's when the performances became so magical in so many ways. But, back to your point, I think what we've done for youth sport is that Own the Podium has imbued the message that we as a sporting nation now want to be the lead, right? We're no longer the nice neighbor to the north. We're no longer the polite, sort of sorry nation.
We're not here to participate.
There you go, right? We're now here to kick ass and take prisoners, and I get it. I do. From a marketing standpoint, it's what we learn as kids. It's what Hollywood celebrates, so I understand it.
Yep.
But what that's done is it's flicked a switch in youth sport where the message has trickled down, and we now feel that that's it. That's my job. This is about we're now a nation of winners, and by golly, I am going to coach to win. And so that has taken over the participation piece, the get better piece, the be your best piece. Like, that's no longer the message. And so if you're a young athlete and you step into a sporting environment that is only about producing top athletes, and that's not why you're there, you're going to go to a place where you feel welcome and where you are having fun. I mean, when they interview young athletes across the country, why do you do this sport? Winning lands, around 6, 7, 8 down there. The top reasons are because they want to hang out with their friends, right? They want to have fun.
Yep.
And that's what participation is about. And So I think that's where we've shot ourselves in the foot, is that we thought, okay, let's become this nation of winners. And what's happened is we've attracted a crowd to the coaching ranks that have dissuaded youth from involving themselves in sport that would, and this is the irony in this, that would build a larger athlete pool
Yep.
that would then eventually create higher performers. So, and that's the crazy part in this, right? Is that we have undermined Own the Podium's mission by having Own the Podium as the message. Because now the pool of athletes that we draw from is getting smaller every single year. And so, I get it. I understand why they did what they did, but now it's at a point where how do we correct course, right? How do we clean this up?
I couldn't agree more. I'm a firm believer that the performance in any sport is a pyramid, and the wider the base of your pyramid, the more people that you have participating, the higher your peak is going to be, regardless of how you coach it.
Agreed. Yep. I mean, I'm heartened to hear that echo back to me, because you'd be shocked at how many people who have jobs and positions in this country that have a significant impact don't agree with that, right? And that's the problem. That's part of the problem.
Well, and on that note, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the opportunity that I've been given from the Ottawa Rowing Club to kind of create the environment that I envision. It's not a win at all costs. We're not my salary isn't contingent on X number of Henley medals or U.S. nationals or schoolboy medals or whatever it is. We are just creating an environment that is inviting, and our numbers have flourished even post COVID. We're back up to the highest numbers we've ever had for membership across all of our programs. So we're in a great spot, thankfully, moving forward, and hopefully that means more medals as a byproduct.
For sure. I mean, I would say more than hopefully, right? I think if you look at successful programs around the world, I would agree with what you've said. It starts with a large base, and from that base, my philosophy is always develop the athlete first, and the specialist will come from that, right? And so when it becomes about participation at the beginning, at the onset, where everyone's welcome, you build a broader pool, and the ones who want to go higher, fill your boots. You can go higher, and those who just want to stay on a participation level, that's okay too,
Absolutely.
right? And but I think and that only follows human nature, and that's where this notion of holistic coaching. When people say, well, quite often in the work that Robin and I do in our workshops with coaches, we often get the question, yeah, but I'm a professional coach. It's my job to win.
No, it's your job to
How can
coach.
I, right? How can I focus on the being, the whole body of the athlete when the opposite of what you said is true, Zach, where my pace is contingent on winning.
Yep.
And what we invite those coaches to consider is that it's not a choice. When it becomes about the human being first, you support high performance, right? And I would challenge any coach to show me research otherwise. As human beings, we are attracted to safe environments. We want to be in a community where we are surrounded by like-minded people who understand us, who appreciate us, who support us, who have our back. And in an environment that is a dog eat dog environment, you build a culture of mistrust, of the opposite of safety, right? A culture of threat. And in that culture, as human beings, we don't flourish, right? We withdraw and we become paranoid, and everybody's the enemy, and we start to think on a small level, small scale. And that's not where high performance grows from. And so when we start to see high performance through the lens of an athlete centric lens, one that embraces holistic coaching as a strategy, that's when things starts to change, right? And that's the part that we love about our work, is that when coaches start to see that holistic coaching is a strategy for high performance, they sort of go, okay, well, tell me a little bit more about that, right? Because in so many ways, you have to undo the story before you can introduce a new way of being, right? A new paradigm.
Well, and understanding how
So
that approach translates to external success.
for sure. And that's what it was for me, Zach, was that, I needed to lose on the world stage the way I did in Seoul in order to have a reason to go looking for something different, right? And when I found Robin and I saw this approach to high performance that I would have mocked as a young athlete, right? That I would have made
Yep.
fun of. When I saw it work time after time, year after year, I was just like, well, you know, I'd be an idiot to not try this on,
Maybe
to
there's some
not see
merit to
it.
this.
Right. Right. And so when we work with coaches, it's kind of hard for them. I feel like I've got an unfair advantage because I've had a 20-year journey, a 10-year journey of this journey of discovery where I hit some pretty rough moments and then was forced into looking for a different way of living. And thankfully, sort of found Robin and found this different way of not just competing, right? Robin's approach wasn't just about 3,000-meter races or 5,000-meter races. It was about life, right? I had been convinced that life was about chasing stuff,
Yep.
and that in order to feel worthy, you had to do things that were extraordinary, and you had to have things that were extraordinary. And when I met Robin and I did a lot of soul searching, I realized that that was a big freaking lie. And yeah, and I know better now, right? But of course, the paradox is when I stopped chasing stuff, more stuff started becoming available to me, right? I started to become quote unquote more successful.
Yep.
And yet that isn't what we're taught as young men and women, right? We're taught that, eye on the prize, right? Um, and yeah, and um, that's a misnomer. That is what I would consider really poor advice. But I've lived it now, right? So I've lived that and figured it out. So when we work with coaches, it's hard to give them that lived
Of
experience.
course.
So you have to invite them to just try it on, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
Well, and fortunately for the rest of us, so be it the rowing community or coaches as a whole, both you and Robin have had the opportunity to kind of transition your career. So you've taken a lot of those lessons that you learned, those experience, and have found a way to share them with other people or impart that knowledge. So in
Right.
addition to being an accomplished athlete, you are now also an accomplished author, having written 3 books so far, 2 of which I've had the chance to read. So Pulling Together and Chariots and Horses. And the third
Right.
one I received my signed copy of 2 weeks ago. What compelled you to transition out of sport into writing, especially since you've got lots of experience with high performance training, teaching, public speaking? Your coaching career was going well. At what point did you say, "Hey, you know what? I got to write this down. I got to share what I know with the world"?
Right. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Good question. I think, and you're not the first, right? There's been a lot of conversations with friends, with rowing friends especially, who have said, Jace, you're just getting started here. Like, look what you just did look what you did at Shawnigan. Look what you've just done at Ridley. Why don't you keep going? Why don't you try this on at the university level? Why don't you coach at the national team level? And I think for me, Zach, it just became, it wasn't a been there, done that. Like, it wasn't like, well, this isn't challenging enough anymore. It wasn't that at all. It was, I wanted a broader, um, I wanted to have a greater impact, right? When I coached rowing, I worked with 8 boys, 12 boys, you know, 4, what have you, right? And And I loved those boys. And I look back at that time and I am so grateful for that opportunity, right? But I sort of thought, I want this, I want the, like, if this is about transforming lives, Jace, then perhaps there's an opportunity to do this on a grander scale, right? Maybe you can share this message with others and then they can go out and transform lives. And so the ripple becomes greater than just 4 or 8 at a time. And that's ultimately what kind of drew me was the idea that as much as I love coaching rowing and and hanging out with teenage boys, because it's just such a buzz, right? That they are hilarious, and
Never a
it
dull
was the
moment.
favorite part. Sorry.
Never a dull moment.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, it is. It's just, it just, I loved my time. And, but I just wanted something different. And I thought, well, if I coach coaches, then maybe they can take this message and they can transform lives. And that's what it became about. And then that work transferred into the corporate world, and we started working with companies, and we started working in education in the classroom. And so it just became broader. As I said earlier, it wasn't just about sport, it became about life. And so that's what we do. And so now we work with many different sectors around performance and around creating what we call healthy high performing cultures. And then we coach individually as well, working with people one on one. So I look back now, and the trajectory sort of makes sense to me in some ways, but yeah, I feel like I've had a pretty fortunate gig in terms of the way things have evolved.
So when you shifted your focus, or when you and Robin shifted your focus towards life as a whole, how did that impact the writing and the release of your most recent book, Ike? And would you be able to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, I think as I've shared at the book launches, it was a story that was hanging around for a long, long time, right? Almost more than 10 years, and there had been some little starts and pauses and starts and pauses, and then when COVID hit it, like all of us, I had time, right? And so I thought, well, I'm gonna give this a really good shot here, and so I committed myself to telling that story. And for those of who don't know the story, and I mean, goodness, they'd have no reason to know it. Ike was a golden retriever, and he was my first dog per se. And I got him through the Canadian Guide Dogs for the Blind as a puppy walker. So it was my job to have him for a year and then to give him back. And so during that year, the job is to socialize and sort of teach them the basics of how to walk, how to sit, how to stay, and how to go to the bathroom on command, all the things that they would need as being the eyes for someone who was blind.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in school. I was at Emily Carr, first year graphic design, and so with the jacket that comes with these little puppies, you can take them anywhere. And so Ike came with me to class and to restaurants and to movies and shopping, and it was a pretty cool first year. Right, we did everything together, and but the universe had different plans, and we ended up spending. He ended up being removed from the program and became my dog, and I think in so many ways became my guide dog, and so hence the name of the book, Ike, the dog who saved a human. And spoiler, I'm the human, right? And the story is told through his eyes, because I just thought, as a writer, it was just more interesting to get into the mind and the heart of a golden retriever puppy and dog, using dog wisdom, as dog owners will understand,
Mm-hmm.
um, and just putting that slant on it, right? What would it be like to tell a story two people living together for a lifetime, a dog's lifetime, and their journey and the impact of of that dog on that human. What could that look like? And so that, to me, sounded like a really cool creative endeavor and a challenge. And so, I kind of went after it.
Fantastic. Well, if any of our listeners are interested, where can they find your book?
Well, they can find it at my website, my Shopify website, which is lovereadingike.com, and Ike is spelled IKE. So lovereadingike.com, and then they can either buy it from that website, or there's a link in there if they want to go to Amazon. If they have Prime and they want to order it on Amazon, that's totally fine too. Excuse me. Because if you have free shipping through Prime, totally get it. You can do that. If you want to buy it from myself, that's fine too. The only perk, I guess, would be that you get a heavier stock paper, you get colored photographs, and if it matters to you, you get it signed as well. So
awesome.
So that would be that.
Well, we can certainly share that link in the show notes for anybody that's interested.
Okay,
too.
You bet.
Wicked. Well, look, Jace, we've gone way over the time that I told you we were going to take. But before I let you go, I just wanted to know if there's anything you'd like to share with the listeners, or any thank yous that you'd like to share from your rowing career, from your writing career, or anything else. And then I promise we'll sign off and you get back to your day.
Yeah, no, it's been wonderful. Your questions have been engaging, and there's nothing better than sitting down to an interview where the interviewer, has done their homework, and clearly you have. So thank you for that. And I don't know that I have anything, Zach. I think you've covered it really, really well. And I think just reemphasizing the notion of getting very clear, if we're going to make it rowing specific, getting super clear on why you are engaged in the sport, right? And running it through the filter of if it's because it sort of lights up my toes and it makes me feel good about myself and it makes me feel good to be in a boat, then those are really good reasons, and you want to hold on to those. If the reasons are because I want something like to be a national champion or a scholarship, or I want to win an Olympic gold medal, those are all good things too. But I don't know, I would just invite you to consider why you want those things, and if those things are going to sustain you through a rowing career.
Yep.
I think that's it.
Enjoy the process. The outcome will happen.
You bet. Yep.
Awesome. Well, look, Jace, thank you very much for jumping on. I really enjoyed our chat, and I think our listeners will too.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome. Take care. We went a little long with this one today, but the conversation was humming so nicely, and I hope everyone was able to find something beneficial in what Jason had to say. I love his approach to fostering a love around the sport at all levels, especially those competing in high-performance environments. Jason's refreshing approach to sport may not align with the traditional perception of a winning culture, but it's pretty hard to argue that it doesn't work when you've got results like his. In today's show notes, I'll be sure to post a link to Jason's website, where interested listeners can grab a copy of his book, Ike. And better yet, I'll give anybody $5 that was a previous dog owner that can get through the first chapter without tearing up. If you're interested in some of Jay's other books on rowing and coaching, I'd highly recommend you check them out. Pulling Together is a fantastic novel. It talks a lot about lessons that we can take away as coaches and athletes. And Chariots and Horses is a little bit more of a biography or autobiography in the time that he spent on the national team and leading up to it. Thank you so much to Jason for his time and his stories today. I really enjoyed our conversation. I hope you all did too. It has been a pleasure chatting with you and being part of your day, and I hope to see you all back in a couple of weeks for our next episode drop. If you enjoyed this episode, I would ask that you please take 30 seconds out of your day and share it with somebody in your circle that you think might enjoy it or benefit from some of the topics discussed. Word of mouth is the easiest way to grow our channel and grow our viewership, and hopefully somebody else can benefit from today's conversation in the same way hopefully you did. It would be also great if you could rate and subscribe to the Doc Talk channel. If you have an idea for a future show, would like to recommend a guest, or just want to pass on some comments, please feel free to shoot me a note at doctalkpod@yahoo.com. Otherwise, wishing you all a very speedy week. Until next time, this has been Doc Talk.